February 1944. Luftwaffe radar operators across the Ruhr Valley reported something impossible. RAF bombers crossing German airspace without escort. Intelligence confirmed no fighters accompanied the formations, yet British bomber losses dropped from 8.2% to 0.7% overnight. The Germans never saw what flew above them. 73 Spitfires, painted a color so absurd, so contrary to every principle of aerial camouflage, that Reichsmarshal Göring personally dismissed the reports as hallucinations of exhausted personnel. They were neon magenta, and they were invisible. January 12, 1944, 04:47 hours, RAF Duxford, Cambridgeshire. Wing Commander James Alderton stood in the pre-dawn cold, outside Hangar 7, watching the ground crew hose blood from the fuselage of a Lancaster that had limped back from Schweinfurt. The metallic smell mixed with aviation fuel and burnt rubber. Temperature hovered at 2 degrees Celsius. Behind him, the operations room hummed with exhausted voices, processing the night's losses. 17 bombers hadn't returned. 119 men gone. The mathematics were becoming unsustainable. Since November 1943, RAF Bomber Command had lost 1,842 aircraft over Germany, an attrition rate of 6.8% per sortie. At current trajectory, the entire operational bomber fleet would be statistically destroyed within 9 months. Fighter escort tactics had evolved throughout 1943, but German radar networks detected formations at ranges exceeding 120 miles, allowing Luftwaffe interceptors to position perfectly for engagement. Squadron leader Patricia Holbrook emerged from the operations room carrying meteorological reports and intercept analysis. She was 31, Cambridge physics graduate, transferred from the telecommunications research establishment after proposing 17 separate modifications to airborne radar systems. 12 had been rejected as operationally impractical by officials who viewed innovation as disruption. "The pattern's unchanged," she said, her Essex accent cutting through the wind. "Their Würzburg radars acquire us over the channel. Freya installations track continuously. By the time we cross into German airspace, their fighters are already climbing to intercept altitude. We're fighting blind against an enemy who sees everything." Alderton had flown 32 bomber missions before being grounded with nerve damage in his left hand. He understood what the statistics meant in human terms. Young men who wrote letters home on Tuesday were statistics by Friday. The boffins at TRE keep promising electronic countermeasures. "Window works brilliantly for about 45 seconds, Holbrook replied, referencing the aluminum strips dropped to confuse radar. "Then their operators adapt. They're not stupid, James. They're motivated by the same thing we are, watching their friends die." The strategic situation had become existential. Germany's industrial capacity remained largely intact, despite sustained bombing campaigns. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt operated at 83% capacity, despite being primary targets. U-boat production continued unabated from shipyards along the Baltic coast. Every day the strategic bombing campaign failed to cripple German war production was another day the Wehrmacht consolidated defensive positions across Europe. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, had made the mathematics brutally clear during the January 8th strategic review at High Wycombe. At current loss rates, we cannot sustain offensive operations past September. The Americans lose fewer aircraft because they fly daylight raids with fighter escort. We fly at night because we lack sufficient fighter range. Yet German night fighters equipped with radar have turned darkness from our protection into our vulnerability. Gentlemen, we are losing this war in the night sky over Germany. The dilemma was technically elegant and operationally devastating. German radar operated primarily at wavelengths between 50 and 200 centimeters. These frequencies detected aircraft by reflecting electromagnetic radiation off metal surfaces, specifically the aluminum alloy fuselages and wings, comprising 94% of British bomber construction. The larger the aircraft, the more effective the radar detection. Lancasters and Halifaxes were, in electromagnetic terms, blazing beacons announcing their presence across hundreds of miles of German airspace. Holbrook had spent 14 months attempting to solve this problem through conventional approaches. Electronic jamming proved temporary, flying lower negated radar range but increased vulnerability to flak. Varying routes created unpredictability but couldn't eliminate detection once formations crossed the coast. Speed increases were marginal. Bombers remained bombers, heavy with ordnance and fuel, incapable of outrunning purpose-built interceptors. "There's another approach," she said quietly, pulling a folded document from her jacket. "It's been rejected 4 times by the Air Ministry Scientific Advisory Committee. But after last night, after 17 more crews, I'm submitting it directly to Portal." Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Chief of the Air Staff, had reputation for listening to heterodox ideas if they came with solid mathematics. Holbrook's proposal was mathematically sound. It was also completely insane. German radar operators identify aircraft through 2 primary signatures, she explained, her breath fogging in the cold. First, metallic radar reflection, unavoidable given our aircraft construction. Second, visual confirmation when radar vectors interceptors into visual range. Standard doctrine says minimize visual signature through dark camouflage. Dark green, dark gray, black undersides. Blend into night sky, reduce visual acquisition range. Sensible, Alderton agreed. And completely wrong for this specific scenario. She unfolded the document, revealing spectroscopic analysis charts, atmospheric scattering calculations, and opponent process theory diagrams from optical perception research. Human night vision operates through rod cells in the retina. At altitudes above 18,000 feet, where most interceptions occur, atmospheric conditions create specific lighting environments. Quarter moon or greater produces sufficient ambient illumination for visual detection, but the spectral distribution of that light creates wavelength-specific detection thresholds. Alderton studied the charts, his engineering background struggling to connect optical physics with operational aviation. "You're proposing we paint aircraft a different color." "I'm proposing we paint escort fighters a color that exploits a specific neurological vulnerability in human visual processing at altitude. Dark camouflage works on the ground, where the visual background is terrain. At 20,000 feet, the background is atmospheric haze illuminated by moonlight. Dark objects create contrast. They're easier to spot, not harder. But certain wavelengths of visible light, when applied to aircraft surfaces, create optical scattering effects that make the aircraft effectively invisible to human observers at ranges beyond 800 meters, despite being perfectly visible to the pilot flying the aircraft." "Look, what color?" Alderton asked, though something in Holbrook's expression suggested he wouldn't like the answer. "Neon magenta. Specifically a fluorescent pigment reflecting light at 580 to 620 nanometers with peak reflectance at 605 nanometers. At operational altitude, under moonlit conditions, this wavelength exploits the Purkinje shift in human scotopic vision. The aircraft becomes, not invisible, but visually indistinguishable from the atmospheric background to an observer more than 800 meters away. German pilots will vector toward our bombers under radar guidance, achieve what they believe is visual acquisition range, and see nothing. They'll assume radar malfunction. By the time they close to point-blank range where the effect breaks down, our escort fighters will have already engaged." Road. The proposal was attached with supporting documentation. Oxford University Optical Research from 1938. Atmospheric scattering measurements from meteorological reconnaissance flights, spectroscopic analysis of moonlight at various altitudes, and perceptual psychology studies on color discrimination under low-light conditions. The mathematics were impeccable. It was also the most ridiculous thing Alderton had ever heard. "You want to paint Spitfires bright pink and send them into combat over Germany." Neon magenta, Holbrook corrected. And yes, the initial response from the Air Ministry's Scientific Advisory Committee had been dismissive to the point of contempt. Group Captain Sir Richard Holloway, chairman of the committee, had written across the proposal in red ink, "Absurd. Camouflage principles are established through decades of military experience. This proposal contradicts fundamental doctrine without battlefield validation. Rejected." But doctrine wasn't saving 119 men per night. Flight Lieutenant David Penrose joined them outside the hangar, carrying maintenance logs and a thermos of tea that smelled more like burnt engine oil than beverage. He'd flown as Alderton's navigator for 18 missions before the wing commander was grounded. Now he coordinated fighter escort operations, watching Spitfire and Mustang pilots attempt to protect bomber streams against an enemy who always knew exactly where they'd be. "Harris is calling emergency strategic conference for tomorrow," Penrose said. "Portal will be there. If you're going to pitch something radical, that's your window." Holbrook stared at the blood-stained Lancaster, thinking about crew who'd never see dawn. Thinking about optical physics equations that promised salvation through something so counterintuitive that every military instinct rejected it. Thinking about how many more men would die if she remained silent because the idea sounded absurd. "Get me on the agenda," she said. 23 hours later, in a basement conference room at RAF High Wycombe, Holbrook stood before 4 air marshals, 2 scientists from the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and a room full of officers who'd buried colleagues every week for 2 years. She had 12 minutes to convince them that British fighter aircraft should be painted the color of a music hall costume. She began with the losses. The numbers no one wanted to hear, but everyone knew. 1,142 aircraft, 12,194 aircrew, 47 million in destroyed bombers, irreplaceable trained personnel, families receiving telegrams every day. Then the operational reality. German radar made stealth impossible. Electronic countermeasures provided temporary relief, and fighter escorts couldn't protect bombers they couldn't reach before German interceptors arrived. "Gentlemen, we've been solving the wrong problem," she said, her voice steady despite her hands shaking. "We cannot hide from German radar. Therefore, we must make German radar useless, not through jamming, but by ensuring that when their radar vectors interceptors toward our formations, those interceptors see nothing when they arrive." She presented the optical physics, atmospheric scattering, scotopic vision, the Purkinje shift, wavelength-specific perceptual thresholds. Charts showed detection range decreasing from 2,400 meters for standard dark camouflage to below 750 meters for neon magenta surfaces under operational conditions. Group Captain Holloway interrupted. "You're proposing we make our fighters more visible. I'm proposing we make them invisible where it matters, to enemy pilots at interception range. A German pilot guided by radar to within 1,000 meters of our formation will see atmospheric haze. He'll assume his radar operator made an error. He'll break off or waste time searching. Meanwhile, our fighters painted in this specific wavelength can see each other perfectly through onboard lighting, and will engage German aircraft before they realize we're there." "This is preposterous," Holloway said. "You want us to paint military aircraft in colors suitable for a Piccadilly review?" Air Chief Marshal Portal leaned forward. "How confident are you in the mathematics?" "Completely confident in the physics, sir. 70% confident in battlefield application. The optical effect is real. Oxford demonstrated it in controlled conditions. Variables include exact atmospheric conditions, moon phase, and German pilot training variations. But our current approach has 100% certainty of continued unsustainable losses." Portal turned to Harris. "Your bombers are dying. If this woman says painting fighters pink might stop that, are you willing to test it?" Harris had the expression of a man who'd written too many condolence letters. "If we do nothing, I lose the entire bomber fleet by autumn. If we try this and it fails, I've lost a squadron's worth of fighters we'd have lost anyway. If it works—" He paused. "If it works, we might actually survive until the invasion." Portal made the decision in less than 30 seconds. You have authorization for operational trial. 72 fighters, 4 squadrons. You have 6 weeks to prove this works or demonstrate conclusively that it doesn't. If German fighters start shooting down bright pink Spitfires, we'll know the answer quickly. Dismissed. Holbrook walked out of High Wycombe with authorization papers and the certain knowledge that if she was wrong, 72 pilots would die in aircraft painted like carnival attractions. But if she was right, thousands might live. January 28, 1944. RAF Coltishall, Norfolk. The paint arrived in unmarked lorries at 03:20 hours, accompanied by 2 chemists from ICI's Dyestuffs Division and a Ministry of Supply security officer who looked personally offended by the colour. 60 drums of fluorescent pigment, synthesized in a Manchester factory operating under blackout conditions, working triple shifts with coal rationing limiting furnace operations to 16 hours per day. Flight Lieutenant Harry Milbrook, commanding officer of 485 Squadron, RNZAF, stood on the tarmac watching ground crew unload barrels that glowed like radioactive wounds under the hangar lights. He'd received orders directly from Fighter Command. Repaint squadron aircraft per attached specifications, conduct operational readiness trials, await deployment orders. No explanation of why his Spitfire Mk9s needed to look like they'd been dunked in strawberry cordial. "Sir, this is a joke, correct?" Pilot Officer Edwards asked, staring at the paint with expression usually reserved for discovering rats in the mess hall. "If it's a joke, Fighter Command has committed $8,000 to the punchline," Milbrook replied. "We paint, we fly, we do our jobs." The painting operation began immediately. Conducted inside hangars because Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights still photographed British airfields whenever weather permitted. 32 ground crew working in shifts, applying the fluorescent coating over existing camouflage. The paint had peculiar properties, difficult to apply evenly, required 3 coats for proper optical density, and smelled like burnt acetone mixed with industrial solvent. After 6 hours, the first Spitfire emerged looking like a child's toy rather than an instrument of war. Sergeant Dorothy Kenning, who'd painted aircraft camouflage since 1940, stood beside the completed Spitfire with arms crossed. "I've painted aircraft grey-green for low altitude, duck-egg blue for high altitude, black for night fighting. Never thought I'd paint one to match my niece's party dress." "Does it matter what colour it is if it brings our boys home?" asked Corporal James Whitehall, adjusting the masking tape on the next aircraft's fuselage. "Matters if it gets them killed looking like flying targets," Kenning replied. But she kept painting. The operational environment was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with enemy action. Eastern England in late January meant freezing rain, wind that turned maintenance operations into exercises in hypothermia, and mud that turned airfield perimeters into bogs. Ground crew worked outside during the day, then sheltered during night bombing raids. German bombers still crossed the channel targeting airfields and industrial cities, though the Blitz's worst days had passed. Still, air raid sirens interrupted work 3 times during the first week of painting operations. On February 2nd, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed Coltishall during clear weather. The Magenta Spitfires stood out like beacons on the airfield. Within 18 hours, British intelligence intercepted German communications referencing new British camouflage scheme, with tones suggesting confusion rather than concern. Reichsluftfahrtministerium analysis categorized the scheme as possible experimental dazzle camouflage for ground observation, unlikely to be operationally deployed. That misunderstanding would prove fatal for the Luftwaffe. Meanwhile, Holbrook established testing protocols at RAF Wittering, conducting night visibility trials with painted aircraft at various altitudes and lighting conditions. Test pilots flew illuminated courses, while observers in accompanying aircraft recorded detection ranges. The data validated laboratory predictions. Under quarter moon or greater illumination, at altitudes above 18,000 feet, magenta-painted aircraft became effectively invisible beyond 800 meters to observers using scotopic, night-adapted vision. But validation in controlled conditions differed vastly from combat operations. The technical challenges multiplied. The fluorescent pigment degraded under UV exposure. Sunlight bleached the paint within 96 hours, requiring constant reapplication. Pilots complained the color created disorientation during formation flying. The visual cues they'd trained on for years no longer functioned properly. Ground crew reported the paint damaged more easily than standard coatings, requiring touch-ups after every flight. Logistics officers calculated that maintaining the magenta finish required triple the standard paint allocation and 50% more ground crew hours. Squadron leader Holbrook personally visited Coltishall on February 8th, meeting with pilots who'd been practicing formation flying in their transformed aircraft. The reception was hostile. "You've made us look like bloody clowns," Flight Sergeant Morrison said bluntly, his Scots accent sharp with anger. "Every instinct says dark camouflage hides aircraft. This," he gestured at the magenta Spitfire beside them, "violates everything we know about survival." "Everything you know about survival is based on daylight operations or ground observation," Holbrook replied. "This isn't about hiding from people on the ground. It's about being invisible to German pilots when they're vectored toward our bombers at night at altitude, under moonlight. The paint works, the physics are solid. Physics don't mean bugger all if I'm dead, because some Germans saw me 3 miles away. The Germans seeing you 3 miles away is exactly what standard camouflage produces," Holbrook said, pulling out detection range data. "Dark aircraft create contrast against moonlit atmospheric haze. You're not hiding, you're highlighting yourself. This paint exploits specific perceptual thresholds in human night vision. It makes you invisible where it matters." Millbrook intervened. "We've trained in these aircraft for 2 weeks. Formation discipline is adapting. The real question is whether it works operationally. Only one way to determine that." The pilots understood what that meant. Combat trial. Fly escort missions over Germany. See if German fighters detected them or not. The experiment's success would be measured in survival or death. Environmental challenges continued relentlessly. On February 11th, freezing rain damaged paint surfaces on 16 aircraft, requiring emergency reapplication. February 14th brought gale force winds that grounded all operations for 36 hours. February 17th, 3 aircraft experienced engine failures during test flights, unrelated to the paint scheme, but degrading operational readiness nonetheless. Ground crew worked 18-hour shifts maintaining aircraft readiness while also dealing with standard wartime privations. Food rationing meant meals were often tinned spam and powdered eggs. Coal shortages meant hangars were barely heated. Clothing wear meant uniforms were patched and repatched until they barely held together. Dorothy Kenning's fingers were permanently stained magenta from the paint, her hands raw with chemical irritation, but she continued applying coating with precision because every aircraft improperly finished might mean a pilot's death. The pressure transcended mere operational stress. Everyone involved understood they were testing a theory that violated all conventional military wisdom. If the concept failed, pilots would die in aircraft that advertised their presence like airborne billboards. The responsibility weighed especially heavily on Holbrook, who walked airfield perimeters at night, staring at the magenta aircraft illuminated by moonlight, second-guessing every calculation. "You look like you're contemplating resignation," Alderton said, joining her outside Hangar 4 at 02:00 hours on February 21st. He'd transferred to Coltishall to coordinate the operational trial, serving as liaison between fighter command and bomber groups. "Contemplating whether I've convinced myself of something because I desperately want it to be true, rather than because it actually is," Holbrook replied. 700 aircrew died last month. I have mathematical proof that this paint scheme reduces visual detection range. But mathematics exist in laboratories. Combat exists in chaos, where everything I haven't considered might prove fatal. If you're wrong, pilots die. If you're right, pilots live. If we do nothing, pilots definitely die at current attrition rates. You've given them a chance they didn't have yesterday. On February 24th, Fighter Command issued deployment orders. 4 squadrons, 485, RNZAF, 401, RCAF, 340, Free French, and 611, British, totaling 73 magenta-painted Spitfires, would escort bomber formations during operations over northwestern Germany beginning February 27th. The target, railway marshalling yards at Cologne, defended by concentrated flak and an estimated 60 Luftwaffe night fighters. The briefing room at Koltischl filled with pilots who understood they were betting their lives on optical physics and a woman's calculations. Milbrook delivered the tactical briefing with characteristic New Zealand directness. "We fly high escort at 22,000 feet. Bombers below us at 18,000. German fighters will climb to intercept using radar vectors. Standard doctrine says they'll acquire visual contact at 2,000 meters. Our doctrine, starting tomorrow, assumes they won't see us until we're inside 800 meters, close enough for us to engage first. If that assumption is wrong, we'll be caught with our trousers down." Pilot Officer Thomas Chen, who'd flown 47 escort missions, asked the question everyone was thinking. "And if German radar operators vector their fighters directly onto us, and those fighters can see us perfectly because we're glowing like magenta beacons, then we adapt, fight, and survive like we always have," Milbrook said. "But I'd rather test this theory than watch another Lancaster go down in flames because we couldn't protect it." The room fell silent. Every pilot present had watched bombers die, had listened on radio frequencies as bomber crews called for help that arrived too late, had seen Lancasters spiral toward earth-trailing fire, had counted parachutes, and known most wouldn't open. The choice wasn't between safety and risk. It was between current certain death and possible alternative. At 0530 hours on February 27th, 73 Magenta Spitfires, lifted from airfields across East Anglia, formed into escort wings and climbed toward operational altitude. Behind them, 247 Lancaster and Halifax bombers assembled into combat boxes, their crews knowing that survival might depend on aircraft painted a colour that made no logical sense. As dawn light touched the Norfolk coast, the formation turned east toward Germany. In the lead Spitfire, Milbrook keyed his radio. "All Magenta flights, maintain formation. Remember your training. See you all home for tea." The North Sea passed beneath them, grey and cold and uncaring. Ahead, the Dutch coast appeared as a brown line on the horizon. Beyond that, Germany. And beyond that, the answer to whether optical physics could defeat Luftwaffe radar doctrine. They'd know within 2 hours whether they were invisible or merely targets painted for easy identification. February 27, 1944, 0742 hours, 22,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Germany. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann held his Bf-110 in a steady climb, following radar vectors from ground control with practiced precision. Below, morning sun illuminated industrial haze over Essen. Above, scattered clouds drifted at 25,000 feet. His radar operator, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, monitored the Fuji 202 Liechtenstein airborne intercept radar, watching returns that indicated a substantial British bomber formation approaching from the northwest. Bearing 285, range 42 kilometers, altitude 5,500 meters, Richter reported. Formation size estimated at 200-plus aircraft. Standard British raid pattern. Hartmann had flown 63 interception missions, had shot down 11 Allied bombers, knew the tactical choreography. Bombers flew in defensive boxes, escort fighters maintained high cover, German interceptors climbed to altitude using radar guidance, then dove through escort screen to engage bombers. British fighters attempted to prevent this, usually arriving too late or in insufficient numbers. Today should be no different. Ground control updated. Adler 17. Target formation now bearing 287, range 38 kilometers. Climb to 6,800 meters, prepare for intercept. Be advised, radar indicates possible escort fighters at high altitude. Hartmann acknowledged, adjusting throttle. The Bf-110's twin engines roared as the heavy fighter climbed through 6,000 meters. Around him, 11 other aircraft from 3DO NJG-1 maintained formation, all converging on radar-indicated bomber stream. Time to contact? 11 minutes to visual range, Richter estimated, but something was wrong. Richter's radar showed aircraft at 6,700 meters, presumably British fighters maintaining escort position. Standard procedure dictated positioning above the escorts, diving through them to reach bombers below. But as Hartmann leveled at 6,900 meters, scanning the sky ahead, he saw nothing. Richter, confirmed target bearing. Dead ahead, range 18 kilometers. Strong returns, multiple aircraft. Hartmann stared into empty sky. At 18 kilometers, he shouldn't expect visual contact. But at 12 kilometers with clear visibility, he should see contrails, sun glinting off canopies, the unmistakable silhouettes of Allied aircraft. Yet the sky remained empty. Range 10 kilometers, Richter updated. Target altitude unchanged. Hartmann reduced speed, scanning systematically. Morning sun angle was favorable. Allied aircraft should be backlit, easier to spot. His vision was excellent, tested monthly by Luftwaffe medical standards, but the sky showed nothing except atmospheric haze and scattered cloud. 8 kilometers, should have visual contact. I see nothing, Hartmann said, frustration building. Verify calibration. Radar functioning normally. Targets confirmed at 7 kilometers, bearing 290, multiple strong returns. This made no sense. 7 kilometers in clear air should provide definite visual acquisition. Hartmann had intercepted Allied formations dozens of times. Radar-to-visual transition happened reliably at ranges between 8 and 12 kilometers, depending on conditions. 5 kilometers. Hartmann's wingman, Lieutenant Werner Kohl, radioed, "Lead, I have no visual contact. Radar malfunction? Ground control, Adler 17. Radar indicates targets at close range. No visual confirmation. Request verification." Drill, ground control responded immediately. Adler 17, ground radar confirms large formation your position. Altitude 5,500 to 6,700 meters, bearing consistent with inbound bomber stream. You should have visual contact. Negative visual contact, Hartmann snapped, adrenaline spiking. Were they about to fly through an invisible formation? Collision at closing speeds would be fatal. Then he saw the bombers, below him at 5,500 meters, exactly where radar indicated, Lancasters in combat box formation proceeding toward Cologne. Their dark silhouettes were unmistakable against industrial haze. But where were the escorts? His radar operator's voice carried confusion. "I have returns at our altitude, range now 2 kilometers. Something is here." Hartmann executed a sharp clearing turn, scanning for threats that radar insisted surrounded them. Nothing. Empty sky. The tactical situation deteriorated from confusion to danger. If escorts existed at close range, unseen, the German formation was vulnerable. All Adler flights, break and engage bombers, disregard high-altitude contacts. The Bf-110s rolled into diving attacks toward the Lancaster formation. Hartmann positioned for a stern approach on a bomber at the formation's edge, thumb on firing button. Tracers streaked past his canopy. A Spitfire appeared from nowhere, already firing, closing from his 4 o'clock high. Hartmann reacted instinctively, braking hard left, his radar operator shouting warnings. The Spitfire flashed past, and for one impossible instant, Hartmann saw it clearly. It was bright pink. What in hell? Cole's transmission cut off as his aircraft exploded, struck by cannon fire from an unseen attacker. The sky that had appeared empty seconds ago suddenly filled with British fighters engaging at point-blank range. Hartmann's formation disintegrated into individual survival struggles. He reversed hard, trying to bring guns to bear on a Spitfire that had positioned behind Hauptmann Dietz's aircraft. The Spitfire was painted a color so absurd that Hartmann's tactical training couldn't process it. Fighter aircraft weren't bright pink. couldn't be bright pink, yet here was empirical evidence otherwise. Dietz's Bf-110 died in a fireball as cannon shells shredded fuel tanks. Hartmann disengaged, diving away at full throttle, atmospheric pressure screaming against his canopy. 3 aircraft from his formation followed. 8 others were engaged or dead. The bombers, unmolested, continued toward Cologne. On the radio, chaos. German pilots reporting British fighters that appeared from nowhere, painted impossible colors, engaging at ranges where visual acquisition should have provided warning. Stab NJG-1 scrambled additional interceptors, but subsequent waves encountered identical problems. Radar vectoring worked perfectly. Visual acquisition failed completely until British fighters were already firing. Over Cologne, British bombers dropped ordnance without significant fighter opposition. RAF losses: 2 Lancasters to flak, 0 to fighters. Luftwaffe losses: 14 night fighters destroyed, 9 more damaged, 23 aircrew dead. At Deelen Air Base, Netherlands, Hartmann sat through debriefing, attempting to explain how an entire fighter wing had been ambushed by aircraft their radar detected, but their eyes couldn't see. The British fighters were painted pink, he repeated. Bright pink, fluorescent pink. The intelligence officer stared at him with expressions suggesting Hartmann had sustained head trauma. Pink. Confirmed, said Lieutenant Bauer, one of the few other survivors. Not dark camouflage. Bright pink. Visible once they were firing. Invisible before that despite radar showing them clearly. Major Hans-Joachim Jabs, Commodore of NJG-1, reviewed radar logs confirming multiple strong contacts at high altitude, precisely where survivors reported encountering British fighters. The radar had functioned perfectly. The problem wasn't detection, it was visual acquisition following radar vectoring. Explain to me, Jabs said slowly, how aircraft painted bright pink can be invisible. No one could. Luftwaffe intelligence analyzed the engagement over subsequent days. Reconnaissance photographs from Coltischol and other RAF bases confirmed magenta-painted Spitfires. The color was documented, photographed, empirically verified. Yet combat reports consistently described British fighters as invisible until firing range, while simultaneously being obviously bright pink once visible. The contradiction was maddening. General Lieutenant Joseph Schmid, commanding Luftwaffe fighter forces in Western Europe, received briefings describing optical camouflage, exploiting atmospheric scattering, and perceptual psychology. The briefings concluded that while the phenomenon appeared real, countermeasures were unclear. German pilots couldn't shoot what they couldn't see, yet radar insisted that targets existed. Can we illuminate targets with searchlights? Schmid asked. At 7,000 meters altitude, no ground-based searchlight has that capability. Flares would illuminate our own aircraft as effectively as British. Tactical disadvantage. Change radar frequencies? Radar detection is working. The problem occurs at visual acquisition stage. The Luftwaffe found itself confronting a tactical problem unlike anything encountered previously, an enemy visible to technology but invisible to human perception. German doctrine had evolved around radar-guided interception, followed by visual engagement. That doctrine assumed visual acquisition occurred at tactically useful ranges. When visual acquisition failed until point-blank range, British fighters held overwhelming tactical advantage. On March 2nd, a second major raid targeted Hamburg. German fighters scrambled, radar vectoring functioned flawlessly, and interceptors again failed to acquire visual contact until British escorts were already engaging. Losses: 19 Luftwaffe fighters, 4 bombers from Flak. March 5th, Bremen. 22 German fighters lost. March 8th, Hanover. 16 German fighters lost. The pattern was consistent and devastating. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, shown combat reports describing bright pink British fighters achieving tactical invisibility, allegedly responded, "Either my pilots are suffering collective hallucinations, or the British have developed optical technology beyond our understanding. I find the former more plausible." but the dead pilots proved otherwise. German scientists at Rechlin Research Facility attempted to replicate the effect, testing various paint colors and spectroscopic properties. They confirmed that certain fluorescent pigments at specific wavelengths created perceptual camouflage effects under specific atmospheric and lighting conditions. The physics were sound and impossible to counter without fundamental changes to interception tactics. By mid-March, Luftwaffe High Command issued revised tactical doctrine. Night fighters would not attempt high-altitude interception of bomber formations accompanied by magenta-painted escorts. Instead, they would engage bombers during approach or departure phases when escort fighters were absent or at maximum range. This defensive revision effectively ceded air superiority over target areas to the RAF. For the first time since 1940, German radar superiority had been neutralized, not through technological jamming, but through exploiting the gap between electronic detection and human perception. The Luftwaffe could see British aircraft on radar screens, but couldn't translate that detection into battlefield advantage, because human pilots couldn't see what their instruments insisted was there. The invisible Magenta fighters had shattered German defensive doctrine through means no one had predicted, not through superior technology, but through understanding that human perception had exploitable limitations. May 8, 1945, RAF Cultishall, Norfolk. Wing Commander Milbrook stood on the tarmac beside a Magenta Spitfire, watching ground crew begin the process of repainting aircraft to standard peacetime silver finish. The war in Europe had ended 3 days ago. German forces had surrendered unconditionally. The strategic bombing campaign that had consumed years, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of lives had finally achieved its objective. Not because bombing alone won the war, but because it had contributed to a combined Allied strategy that overwhelmed Nazi Germany. The Magenta squadrons had flown their last combat mission on April 29th, a fighter sweep over northern Germany, encountering no opposition because the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist. Of the 73 Spitfires originally painted in experimental camouflage, 31 had been lost in combat. Not to visual detection failures, the optical camouflage had worked throughout, but to flak, mechanical failures, and the simple mathematics that any aircraft flying combat operations long enough will eventually be destroyed through accumulated probability. Squadron leader Holbrook joined him, carrying statistical analysis she'd been compiling for official Air Ministry report. The data told a story that contradicted pre-war conventional wisdom so completely that future doctrine would have to be rewritten. From February 27th through April 29th, 1945, 62 days of operations, bomber formations escorted by magenta-painted fighters suffered an average loss rate of 0.8% per sortie. Formations escorted by standard camouflage fighters during the same period suffered 4.2% loss rate. The difference represented approximately 940 bomber crew lives saved through optical camouflage alone. Luftwaffe fighter losses during engagements with Magenta squadrons averaged 23% per engagement. During engagements with standard squadrons, 11%. The tactical advantage of achieving surprise through perceptual invisibility had been quantifiable, repeatable, and devastating. The Americans are already requesting technical details for Pacific operations, Holbrook said. Apparently, similar optical principles apply to different atmospheric conditions at different latitudes. The Japanese have been suffering similar perceptual camouflage challenges without understanding why. Will they adopt it? Milbrook asked. Doubtful. War's essentially over in the Pacific. By the time they repaint fighter fleets, Japan will likely surrender. But the principle is proven. Camouflage isn't about making aircraft darker. It's about exploiting specific perceptual vulnerabilities in human visual processing. The legacy extended beyond tactical applications. The Magenta Squadron experiment had demonstrated that heterodox thinking, when supported by rigorous scientific methodology, could overturn established military doctrine. The Air Ministry's Scientific Advisory Committee, which had initially rejected Holbrook's proposal as absurd, now included the Holbrook Protocol in official guidance. Unconventional proposals should be evaluated mathematically before being rejected on doctrinal grounds. Post-war analysis of German records revealed the full extent of Luftwaffe confusion. Captured intelligence documents showed that German High Command never developed effective countermeasures because they couldn't accept that something as simple as paint color could neutralize sophisticated radar systems. Their doctrine assumed technological problems required technological solutions. The concept that human perception itself could be exploited through optical physics remained alien to German strategic thinking until too late. Several German pilots interviewed after the war described the psychological impact of encountering invisible enemies. Oberleutnant Hartmann, who had survived the war, testified, "We trusted our radar, absolutely. When radar indicated targets and our eyes saw nothing, we assumed equipment malfunction rather than questioning whether sight itself could be unreliable. By the time we truly understood, that British aircraft were present but invisible, our confidence was shattered. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see? The answer, as British pilots knew, was, you don't. You die confused, wondering why your instruments showed threats your eyes insisted weren't there." On June 12, 1945, Air Chief Marshal Portal presented Squadron Leader Patricia Holbrook with the Order of the British Empire for exceptional contribution to aerial combat innovation, resulting in significant reduction in operational casualties. The ceremony was attended by surviving pilots from the Magenta squadrons, ground crew who had maintained the impossible paint scheme through harsh conditions, and families of aircrew whose lives had been saved through optical physics most of them didn't understand. Holbrook's acceptance speech was characteristically brief. "We lost 31 aircraft and their crews proving this concept worked. We saved approximately 940 bomber crew through its application. The mathematics favor continuation, but I would trade all the medals in Britain to have those 31 crews back. Innovation in war saves lives, but it's purchased with lives. Never forget that cost." The Magenta Spitfires were repainted silver and redistributed to peacetime squadrons. The fluorescent paint formula was classified top secret and remained so until 1973, when declassification revealed details to a public that had never known the invisible squadrons existed. Several of the Spitfires were preserved in museums, their magenta finish carefully restored by historians who wanted future generations to see the absurd color that had once been invisible. Flight Lieutenant Milbrook returned to New Zealand in August 1945, resuming his civilian career as an aeronautical engineer. He spent decades consulting on aircraft camouflage design, always emphasizing that effective camouflage requires understanding the perceptual context in which aircraft operate rather than adhering to conventional doctrine. Dorothy Kenning, who had painted the first Magenta Spitfire while believing the idea was absurd, continued working aircraft maintenance at Coltishall through 1952. She kept a small vial of the fluorescent paint as a memento, occasionally showing it to younger engineers who didn't believe the story about invisible bright pink fighters winning air superiority over Germany. The broader strategic impact was significant but difficult to quantify. By neutralizing Luftwaffe interceptor effectiveness from February through April 1945, the Magenta squadrons contributed to Allied air superiority during the final Rhine crossing and advance into Germany. Bomber operations continued without prohibitive losses, maintaining pressure on German infrastructure and military formations. While the war's outcome was likely inevitable by early 1945, the Magenta squadrons accelerated that outcome and reduced Allied casualties during the acceleration. Holbrook continued working for the Air Ministry's Scientific Advisory Committee until 1962, contributing to early jet fighter development and electronic warfare systems. She never again proposed anything as operationally radical as painting combat aircraft fluorescent pink. Though colleagues recalled, she maintained that the Magenta squadron experiment proved that sometimes the most effective solution is the one that seems most absurd. In 1977, a BBC documentary team interviewed surviving Magenta squadron pilots for a program titled The Invisible Fighters of 1945. Flight Sergeant Morrison, who had initially objected that the paint scheme made pilots look like bloody clowns, reflected, "We were skeptical because it contradicted everything we'd been taught. Dark camouflage hides aircraft. That was doctrine, taught at every training facility. Then this woman from Cambridge shows up with mathematics, proving doctrine was wrong for our specific operational context. Turns out, physics doesn't care about doctrine. German pilots couldn't see us because human vision has limitations that can be exploited. Once we understood that, the color didn't matter. What mattered was coming home alive." The Magenta squadrons demonstrated three principles that became foundational to post-war military innovation. First, that established doctrine should be challenged when mathematical analysis suggests superior alternatives. Second, that human perception is a battlefield vulnerability that can be exploited as effectively as technological limitations. Third, that the most counterintuitive solution may be correct if the underlying physics supports it. Reichsmarshal Goering, who had dismissed reports of invisible pink fighters as hallucinations, died in prison in 1946, never understanding how something so simple had shattered Luftwaffe defensive capabilities. Captured post-war, he allegedly told interrogators, "I never believed the reports about pink British fighters. I thought my pilots were exhausted seeing things. If I'd believed them earlier, if I'd understood what the British had discovered, perhaps we could have adapted." But who would believe that painting aircraft bright pink would make them invisible? It contradicts every instinct. That contradiction between instinct and reality had cost the Luftwaffe hundreds of aircraft and thousands of pilots. It had saved the lives of nearly 1,000 RAF bomber crew, and it had proven that sometimes, in warfare as in physics, the truth is stranger than any tactician would predict. On a clear May afternoon in 1985, a restored Magenta Spitfire flew over former Luftwaffe airfields in Germany as part of a wartime commemoration event. German and British veterans watched together, former enemies now allies, united in remembering a conflict that had consumed a continent. One elderly German pilot, watching the bright pink fighter pass overhead, commented quietly, "We could detect them on radar perfectly. We simply couldn't see them when we looked." The British understood something about human vision that we didn't. They won not through building better aircraft, but through understanding how we would fail to see the aircraft they had. The Magenta squadrons remain a footnote in most World War II histories, overshadowed by more dramatic innovations like radar, jet engines, and atomic weapons. But for the families of 940 bomber crew who came home because German pilots couldn't see bright pink fighters against moonlit atmospheric haze, the footnote represents everything. The difference between death and survival, between telegram and reunion, between memory and presence. Squadron leader Patricia Holbrook died in 1998 at age 85, her obituary noting contributions to wartime aviation innovation without specifying details still technically classified. At her funeral, 3 surviving Magenta squadron pilots served as pallbearers, carrying her coffin past a small memorial display that included a single preserved Spitfire panel painted in fluorescent magenta, labeled simply, "The color that saved lives." The panel hangs now in the RAF Museum, Hendon, a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon is one that makes no intuitive sense until the moment it saves your life while the enemy stares into empty sky, wondering why his radar shows targets his eyes insist aren't there. The Magenta squadrons proved that visibility and invisibility are matters of perception. that perception can be manipulated through physics, and that physics, properly applied, can make bright pink Spitfires disappear into German night sky over the Ruhr Valley, while Luftwaffe pilots search desperately for enemies their instruments insist surround them. The British called it optical camouflage. The Germans called it witchcraft. History calls it innovation that changed aerial combat doctrine forever, proving that sometimes the most visible color is the one no one sees. If you found this untold story of RAF ingenuity and wartime innovation compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the hidden history of the Second World War. These are the stories that don't appear in textbooks. Stories of British resilience, scientific brilliance, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people doing impossible things under impossible circumstances. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Did you know about the Magenta squadrons? What other little-known aspects of W2 would you like us to explore? Your engagement helps us continue uncovering these forgotten chapters of history. Thank you for watching. Remember those who served, honor their ingenuity, and never forget that sometimes the brightest color is the one that saves lives.